and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, Ken and I are going to discuss what the ramifications, meaning, and what we can do with the most recent Supreme Court rulings in regards to abortion laws across the country. We know this is something that's important to us, and we know it's something that's important to you, and we want to primarily look through and see what does the Bible say about this, and how does that affect what we do with it. So without further ado, Ken, thank you so much for joining us. You're back at home base. You've been traveling quite a bit, and I know you just got off recording your next school.
That's right.
That will be released. What is before we jump into this, what were you recording? What can people be looking forward to for your schools that you guys release on Orbis Ministries?
The new course is on the person and work of the Holy Spirit and spiritual gifts. We went beyond the gifts of 1 Corinthians 12. We're going to discuss the gifts in Romans 12 as well as in Ephesians 4. And we talked about in the class how to figure out which gifts you likely are operating in, maybe at a kind of a baby being level, nascent level, and how to develop the gifts that you have. And we talked about auxiliary gifts, which complement primary gifts, or what we might think of as primary gifts. I don't think any of them is unimportant, and it would be easy to say these are secondary and these are primary. It's more like, in my mind, an enzyme and a coenzyme. So, what makes them work properly together, all together. So I think we got some good footage and things went well, and we'll be releasing that early next year in the Orbis School of Ministry.
Awesome. Well, thanks for taking time to be with us. And you're representing Texas, where you were filming, so we appreciate you doing that as well. So yeah, let's talk about this this issue that's just monumental. A lot of people didn't think they would ever see the day that this happened, and I think it certainly deserves what little we can contribute to the conversation with us weighing in and hearing your thoughts specifically on it. So Ken, what was the first thing that kind of dropped on you when you heard that it was overturned?
Well, there was a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader. I can't quote it exactly, I don't think, but he says something to the effect of, the arc of justice is long, but the universe tends towards justice, which, he was referring to the discrimination and the racial hatred of his own time. And, one of the songs that came out of the civil rights movement was "We Shall Overcome." I think there's been a sentiment among many people in our country for a long time, going back to 1973 when Roe v. Wade was handed down by the Supreme Court, that fundamentally this was an immoral thing. And I know that some of our listeners won't agree with that statement, and I want to acknowledge that there are clearly very sharply differing points of view on this. I think the view that's been largely articulated is that a woman has a right to do with her own body what she does with her own body. And I think for the most part, most people would agree with that. But as with most things that have to do with personal rights, there are limitations. And so for those that have opposed abortion, we don't use this kind of language very much anymore in public discourse. But there was a time when we did, including back in '73 and earlier. And I think there were and are a lot of people who view abortion as fundamentally immoral because it is the ending of an innocent life. Now, some people have taken the point of view that children in the womb, and then they started subdividing that into, at this stage, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. They subdivided, well, when exactly does it truly become human? Prior to that, it's just a mass of cells. But I think for those who hold to the traditional views of morality, they view the ending of life in the womb as immoral, period, because this is a child, albeit an embryonic one, that has done nothing wrong, has no ability to defend itself. And so this is violence of a peculiar kind where there is no real opportunity for self-defense even. And then people layer into it that it's uniquely, I want to be careful how I say it because I don't want to appear to be calling people out, but it's uniquely perverse or uniquely difficult because I think most people understand on a visceral level that mothers ought to care for and defend their children. So, by the way, should their fathers, but fathers don't carry children in their bodies, at least not until the scientists figure out how to re-engineer the human body enough that men start carrying children. But at least through all of human history, literally the entirety of human history, men did not carry children. And so we don't tend to think of it quite the same way. And we have language like maternal instinct or going mama bear. When a woman is in defense of her child, we know this to be true. And using that metaphor, mama bear, we even see it in the animal world that, females of the species in caring for whether it's their ducklings or their baby bears or their fawns or whatever it may be, there's just something about motherhood that is unique and irreplaceable. And so there's a kind of a shock factor until the shock wears off when women are terminating their children. And so really it's all of that wrapped together. And I may be leaving some things out even, but as I think about it, this is what has caused many people to view abortion as fundamentally immoral.
Yeah. And I think just to explain to people who, because it's quite polarizing topic. And if we do try and be careful with our language, it has nothing to do with what we think about the issue. It's more about we don't want to appear to be keeping any condemnation on those that may have participated, and trying to walk that line where we don't want to be people that heap condemnation on folks, but at the same time we want to be people that say it's certainly immoral and all of that. So just sort of an explanation on why we're trying to be careful with our language.
Right. It's interesting. I was having dinner last night with a pastor and his wife here in Southern California, and I'd been speaking at their church in the morning service, and then we had an afternoon seminar. And he was saying to me that even more than being a Republican, he said he views himself as a libertarian. And it's interesting, among the Christians that I know who I would say take the Bible seriously, none of them would be fully in the libertarian camp because libertarians support abortion. And, in general, Christians who take the Bible seriously don't support abortion. But it was interesting in talking with him because the more we talked, it became apparent to me that the vast majority of Christians that I know, but for the fact of abortion or the issue of abortion, they probably would be more libertarian than Republican, because the libertarians, by their very nature, allow people to have liberty in personal matters. And I think the whole notion that we see in the scripture, I'm taking it slightly out of context, but I don't think the sentiment is out of context. The prophets speak of every man will sit under his own vine and fig tree. Every person should have the right of self-determination, economically, politically, whatever. And so even the notion that we might have to regulate something that pertains to personal freedom, I think in some ways cuts against the grain for even Christians. And yet for Christians, the value that supersedes the notion of personal liberty is the idea of God's righteousness and God's law. And of course, sometimes God's righteousness and law come into conflict with what we think of as acceptable on a human level. And of course, this is where the fight begins. But I think it's helpful for people to recognize that I don't think Christians are out to be Dr. No for the most part. There are some, yes, naturally, that are that way. I can think of the Westboro Baptist Church group. And there's been, various times in history where the church has been, well, we'll just say controlling. But I could say in many cases, religious systems in general, not just Christian ones, can become controlling and directive. But generally, it's because they are attempting to regard that higher power, that higher law, that higher righteousness as they understand it.
Yeah, and I think we want to be careful. I mean, like you're saying, as the church, we really want to be a place that people can feel like they can come into and receive, the love of Jesus, along with the standards and all of that sort of thing. And
Right.
I mean, I know for us in our church, I think it was ruled on a Friday, where the ruling came out, and on Sunday, before, like 20 minutes before our first service, I got word that there was a reporter from NPR that wanted to interview us about what we thought, and all of that for some reason. And so, just even to participate in that was, somewhat illuminating. When his view, he was seeing a lot of, I think, mostly on social media, posts of people really celebrating it, and he was trying to draw a comparison between how do you feel about it? Are you guys pumping your fists and saying we got one, while there's so many people that, in his words, were afraid and feeling like their rights were being infringed and it wasn't safe, those sort of things. So we don't want to come off as that way to people of who need help, but at the same time we want to recognize that this is a mostly positive thing, I think, and that's kind of what we're going to talk through in this. So specifically, Ken, we're talking about the Dodds versus Jackson women's health ruling that
That's
came
right.
across.
That's right.
In this, and it was on June 24th. So as we're filming this, a little less than a month ago from today.
Right. So yeah, we're recording mid-July, and we're closing in on the 1 month milestone. So what does this really mean? Well, at the simplest level, it means that there is no longer a universal right to abortion everywhere in the United States of America. But that is not the same thing as saying that abortions are suddenly going to go away. And I think that's an important point to make. Regardless of whether you support abortion or you are opposed to abortion, I think it's important to recognize that, because one of the things that has happened and I think this goes on in every age of the world, but I've noticed in America, the truth has become a fungible commodity. And this is always a risk in political discourse. And it has become a greater risk, I'd say, in the last several years. Anybody who was alive and who remembers people like Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather, there was a time where, we even used to say truth, justice, and the American way. Well, what we were really saying was that truth and justice were part of the American way. And we expected that the truth would come out and that we wouldn't just twist it to mean anything we want it to mean for our own benefit. And so in a situation like this one, I think it could be very easy that somebody would decide to raise money on the back of this decision. And by the way, this could be true in both the pro and the anti-abortion camp. And as part of that money raising process, people may say things that aren't actually true, or they're not thoroughly true, even if they seem on the surface to have the ring of truth. And so I know I've heard some reports, read some things online, seen some news broadcasts where people seem to be saying that the right to abortion has gone away in America, and this is a terrible thing. In fact, abortion still exists on the books in many states. I live in California. Abortion is legal in California, and vacating Roe v. Wade does not have an effect on the state law in California. And as a consequence, California has named itself a sanctuary state. There are some other states that have done this as well. And as you might suppose, most of them tend to be what we call blue states versus red states. But if you are a woman who wants an abortion, it's not as though you can't get one. It just might have become a little more inconvenient and expensive to get from wherever you live to a state where it's available on demand. And yet a lot of the sanctuary states, and our governor, made an announcement that they were building partnerships between California and some of the major corporations in America, so that people could come here, all expenses paid, be put up in a hotel, have the procedure done, and then, go home. And so I think as time goes by, again, we're less than 30 days since this decision was handed down of Dodds versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization. As time goes by, I would not be surprised to see more and more of that sort of thing happening for those who want to do it. In addition, we now have abortifacients available by prescription. And Bob Jones, and we've spoken of him before on this show, he was a remarkably accurate prophet. He actually said the day would come where you could buy abortion pills over the counter. That doesn't exist right now, but he hasn't been wrong on most of his big prophecies that he gave while he was still alive, sometimes back in the 70s or the 80s. And so I would not be surprised to see these pills become available. And unless states outlaw the sale of that specific drug within their boundaries, it will likely be the case that for many women, if they want to terminate a pregnancy, they will be doing it with a pill, even if they live in a state that has laws on the books that forbid abortion. So it's not really true to say that abortion is no longer available to the women of America, but it is true to say that in some circumstances, it's become more expensive and more difficult.
Right, and more expensive and more difficult. And I think, that's some of the pushback that I have heard from folks, is that it disproportionately affects lower income people, because if you have means, you can go get it still, and all of that sort of thing. And so I think that's in the milieu as well with what is happening here. And just to kind of piggyback on what you were talking about with Bob Jones and the pills, I have heard and I've read several articles where they're really pushing to make those over the counter in order to broaden. Yeah.
For that reason.
Right. And I don't know if it was I don't know if I was talking with you or somebody else, but they were talking about one of the most important issues to Bob Jones that he would continually say is we have to continue to contend and pray to see an end to this. We can see an end to this, and when it happens, it's going to be a real big deal in consequence to other things that are happening. So I don't know if that was with you or somebody else, but
I think it was actually when we interviewed Mike Bickle.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. And, just on that point of it falls differentially on the poor, there's truth in that statement, but let's just be clear. There are many things that are in law that fall differentially on the poor. I'm not saying that we want to, throw the poor under the bus or ignore their plight, but this is really going to blow this podcast up, and I know it. And I'm kind of doing it with trepidation, but here we go. Let's talk about another highly controversial issue, not on abortion. And I don't want to get down a rabbit trail with it, but it's illustrative of this very point that you raised. And then we'll return to the topic of this decision. The topic of gun ownership in America. Most of our listeners probably don't realize that before the Gun Control Act of 1968, so think for a second, how long ago was that? That was 54 years ago. Before the Gun Control Act of 1968, if you lived in the United States, you could buy a gun from anyone through the mail. across state lines. You just mailed a check or transmitted money, I guess, by a wire, and as long as the seller was honest, would sell you the gun and would mail it to you. There was no record keeping or tracking system at all, and this is what happened. Well, then, as a result of several high-profile assassinations, including President John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and an attempt on the life of George Wallace. So all four of these occurred during that cauldron period of time in the early 1960s. Congress passed the Gun Control Act of 1968. And one of the things that came out of that was the requirement that anybody who was going to buy a gun had to have a background check. And you, of course, the buyer pays the fee for the background check. Well, I think most people understand, whether or not they like it is a different thing, but I think most people understand that the Second Amendment seems to confer a right of gun ownership on American citizens. In fact, some of our early Supreme Court justices noted that this was one of the things that made America unique among all the nations of the world. But immediately people started saying, well, this is going to restrict the rights of the poor to own a gun for self-defense. And as the years have gone by since 1968, there have been some modifications to the GCA, as it's usually called, the GCA 68, Gun Control Act of 1968, that have put in other layers of checking and restrictions and permitting. And there's usually some fee associated with that. Additionally, at the state level, many states have put in comparable kinds of rules. In the state of California, where I live, you have to go through a state level check beyond what the federal check is, and you pay for that. And so, states like New York have this, Illinois has it, Hawaii has it. These are part of what has come to be. And if somebody lives in a poor area and they want to own a gun for self-defense, and I'm aware of all the arguments about gun violence in poor areas, I'm just saying there are people who live in poorer areas and they would like to be able to own a gun for self-defense. They're citizens, they're not criminals. They, at least in theory, ought to have the ability to do that. If they want to do that, it's going to fall differentially hard on them to pay these various fees and permitting and background checks and all that before they can finally purchase a firearm. And we could say for the record that at least at whatever level you believe it to be true, gun ownership is enshrined in the Second Amendment. It's in the Constitution. Abortion never was. It was discovered in the penumbra, as Stephen Breyer said, the emanations of the 14th Amendment and the right to be secure in your own features and facilities. So we've got one that is absolutely in the Constitution, one that was divined or intuited from the Constitution. And in both cases, the right to exercise or the ability to exercise the right becomes more expensive.
Right.
So I hear the argument, but sometimes people get on their hobby horse about one specific issue. And I think we need to be considering many of these sorts of issues and how regulation and all of it ultimately affects those who are economically not as privileged or advantaged. And I think if we looked at a lot of our laws and regulations with that in mind, we might come to very different answers about some of the regulation that's in our country.
Right.
For example, food is more expensive because of some of the regulation around how food gets made. Well, expensive food is more difficult for those who are economically disadvantaged to deal with than is food that isn't regulated in that manner. So again, most regulation, most law formation, on some level, it falls harder on those who don't have as much.
Right.
That doesn't mean we shouldn't always pass these laws. I mean, there are times when we need them. They are social good. They have to do with regulating a society and creating what we might call a fair and just order. And of course, there's lots of debate about what's fair and just. I'm aware of all of that. I'm just talking at the tabletop level, just basic concepts here, that regulation always has a cost associated with it. And it's one of the reasons why people who tend to be on the red side of the ledger, and Republicans, or for that matter, libertarians, they often oppose regulation. They oppose a lot of these kinds of laws because they do realize that in the end, they do cost somebody something, and whoever ends up paying it, if they have a smaller wallet versus a bigger one, it's going to be a bigger percentage of the small wallet than the big one.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not always obvious, and so I'm pointing that out.
Yeah, I think it's good.
All right, so let's go back to what's the implications of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, as I said, some states, many states, have laws that codify a right to abortion. And so these remain in effect, regardless of the fact that Roe v. Wade has been appealed. And as it stands right now, it's almost an even split across the country. So really what this applies to is about half the states. I had it on my fingertips when we sat down, and just now my mind is not pulling it up, and I don't want to misspeak on the air. So I'll just say it's about half have these pro-abortion laws available. Then there are some laws that were on the books prior to 1973, but they were not enforced during the time that Roe v. Wade was in effect. And now that Roe v. Wade is gone, those laws could be enforced again, but that doesn't mean they will be enforced again. There are many laws that are passed into law, and for various reasons, officials look the other way, or they deem it to be too expensive to enforce, and they simply don't do it.
Right.
So those laws that existed prior to Roe v. Wade might go back into force, but maybe they won't. And we could think of several things that kind of fall into this category. Many of the states in the United States actually have laws on the books forbidding various forms of marriage that would be deemed either polygamous or incestuous or whatever. Many of them have laws against certain sexual practices, but those are not enforced. And they've never been rescinded either. They simply are not enforced. Again, going back to California, some years ago now, we passed an amendment. It wasn't a huge majority, but there was a clear majority where marriage was to be defined between only a man and a woman in California. And I said amendment. It wasn't an amendment. It was what we call Corey, you're going to need to edit out this long gap. I'm sorry. It's called a proposition. So we passed this proposition, and it passed with a 58% majority. And it was no sooner enacted into law, and then first the Attorney General of California said, "I will not enforce this." And then the governor said, "I will not compel the Attorney General to enforce this." And it was taken to the California Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court said, "We will not enforce this. It was passed in a valid way, but there's no way that we're going to allow this to go into force." Now, you could have a big discussion about whether this is right and proper governance. I mean, what the people vote in, you could make the argument it should be voted in, but it was deemed that in the interests of the social good and protecting the interests of the minority, they were not going to enforce this law. Well, there's a lot of laws like that, and they don't all deal with, marriage or sexuality, but there's a lot of laws in this country that are simply not enforced. They're overlooked or they're bypassed. And so with regard to these pre-Roe laws, I suppose there will be states, even red states, where they say, yeah, that law was passed in 1958, but no, we're not going to enforce that one. Now, that's maybe dim comfort for somebody who, wants to have an abortion in their own state. But as long as those laws are not being enforced, they're not being enforced. And so I think the risk of reprisal is low.
Right.
All right. Then another thing that all of this deals with, is trigger laws. And this is actually why the date when this verdict was handed down on Dodd's. These trigger laws are ones that were signed into law but kept in dormancy pending a time when Roe v. Wade might be repealed or overturned. A lot of states have pro-life trigger laws on the books. Most of them have what's called a fuse for obvious reasons. And generally that fuse length is 30 days. Some of them are 45 or 60 days. So as we approach the 30-day mark from the passing of or handing down of the Dodd's verdict, which 30 days will be on July the 22nd. Well, no, because we got a 30-day month in June, right? So as we approach that date, then some of these trigger laws will go into effect, and they will have the intended consequence of restricting abortion access in those states where they apply. That is definitely underway. And then we have enjoined laws. And so a lot of states have pro-life laws that had been ruled unconstitutional by courts. And now those could be brought back into effect with Roe having been reversed. But keep in mind that with those enjoined laws, some part of them are going to need a further legal process because a court had already put a stay in motion to stop their enforcement. And generally those stays don't go away automatically. So there'll at least be another visit to the courtroom and more legal fees to get those all to go into effect. So as you can see from what I've said, this thing with Dodd's, it does not automatically end the right to abortion, nor does it automatically mean that everything that Roe stood for goes away, because there may be other laws at a local level or a state level that in one way or another continue to keep the effect of Roe v. Wade in force. And we now have a hodgepodge. Before we had one federal overarching decision that governed this. Now we have a hodgepodge, and we'll make our way through the hodgepodge, and this will make the courts busier for sure.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see. Ken, I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to know. There's been a tremendous amount said since this of the prophetic significance in the time of history that we're living in the scope of things in regards to our country and what it might mean for us. I know a lot of people have said a lot of things. What is your sense on that, and where are you tracking with the significance of having this on the books as far as like abortion is? I've heard the language people use is our land is under a curse because of this thing. What do you think about that? And if so, does this automatically lift the curse, I guess, or does it? Is it state by state? Some states will have a curse lifted, and some states will be a curse. How does that work in this? I mean, what is your thought or your sensing?
Well, there's no question biblically, and this goes back to the morality question. There's no question biblically that the shedding of innocent blood, or what is sometimes termed the unjust shedding of blood, brings a curse on a land. And let's just stop for a second and clarify that language. You may remember sometime back we did a podcast on just war theory, and we said that at least if you follow the tenets of just war theory, there might be times when war is justified. And in that sense, it's not unjust. And so there wouldn't be presumably a curse that comes on a country that engages in a just war. Now, an unjust war, that's a very different sort of thing. And I think history actually is replete with examples of countries that waged unjust war and were either severely chastised or destroyed as a result. I think there's plenty of examples of that in history. because, to quote Martin Luther again, the arc of justice is long, but the universe tends towards justice. And so, God may move more slowly than we would like, but that doesn't mean he isn't going to move at all.
Well, and I even think, and as we're speaking about this, that does bring up a lot of thoughts. There could be multiple areas of unjust bloodshed. And, maybe some people might be thinking this is sort of a light switch type of a thing, that now that this Supreme Court has made this ruling, it's all going to be great again, or things are going to be whatever. I mean, what do you think? I mean, how should we think as Christians, as biblical thinkers, as people who take the scriptures seriously? How should we be thinking about this?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, Grant. Right now we're talking about abortion. And if you understand the idea, and again, I know some of our listeners won't agree with this, and I want them to know that I know that. But if you take the idea that shedding the blood of the innocent is an abomination in the eyes of God, and you understand that babies in the womb are the most innocent of the innocent, then clearly God would be opposed to abortion. And so by allowing abortion to go forward, we are shedding the blood of the innocent in our own country, and there would be a penalty for that inevitably would accrue. It's interesting in the Bible that we have the story of a king, a Judean king named Manasseh. And the scriptures make it clear that Manasseh was the most wicked king that Judah ever had. And for those who don't know biblical history, just a quick lesson here. Israel at one time was an integrated, unified nation. After the death of King Solomon, David's son, the nation split into two kingdoms, one in the north called the Kingdom of Israel, and 10 of the 12 Jewish tribes were associated with Israel. And then in the south, you had the Kingdom of Judah, and not surprisingly, the tribe of Judah was part of that kingdom, along with the tribe of Benjamin. So Judah was only 2 tribes. Israel was 10 northern tribes. None of the kings of Israel get a good report card in the Bible. They're all viewed as scumbags and scoundrels, and most of it had to do with idolatry, the worship of other gods beyond the Lord, and sexual immorality, and some of it having to do with violence and oppression of the poor. There were some other issues, but those are our top 3 that we read about over and over and over again. Down in Judah, things were sometimes better and sometimes worse. We have a few kings who get, pretty good report cards. We've got a king named Asa. We've got another one named Uzziah. They weren't perfect, and the scripture again, it gives them maybe a B plus. They don't use that lettering system, but something like that. Hezekiah is viewed as a righteous king. And at one point he was going to die, and he prays and the Lord heals him, and he gets 15 additional years, during which time he sires a son whose name is Manasseh, who becomes the most wicked and evil king in the history of Judah. And you could even ask the question, how did such a godly man end up with such a wicked son? And that question isn't fully answered in scripture. It just is a fact that stands there. Sometimes righteous parents have ungodly children who walk away from the Lord. Maybe in that last 15 years of his life, Hezekiah was not as true to the Lord as he should have been. And so he raised his son with a poor role model. But whatever it is, Manasseh was a very, very evil king. And he did a lot of things, including sacrificing his own children in fire to foreign gods. So he engaged in idolatry. And the scripture says that he made the streets of Jerusalem run with the blood of the innocent. And the scripture goes on to say through the prophets, it's not in the historical books, but through the prophets, that God determined to wipe out Judah and send them into exile because of this, because of the shedding of innocent blood. The Lord was willing to put up with a lot of the other sins that the other kings had done. The Lord was willing to put up with some of the sins even that Manasseh would do. But when he began to shed innocent blood, that was the end of the end. And so after Manasseh dies, he has a son named Ammon or Ammon. He lives 2 years, and he's actually worse than his dad. So he's done right away. The Lord takes him out. And then we get this king named Josiah, and he's a righteous king, and he's a reformer, and he rules for about 2 decades, and he turns, or at least tries to turn, the nation of Judah back to God. And the scripture records that a prophet came to him and said, you know, all the things of judgment that have been spoken over this country, this nation, Judah, because of the deeds of your grandfather, they remain in force. But because you have chosen righteousness and have walked in righteousness, the Lord is determined that none of this will happen in your lifetime. You will go down to the grave in peace, and you will not see the things that have been spoken of concerning all that Manasseh brought to this land. But you know, it's about 25 years after Josiah's death that Jerusalem is destroyed by the armies of Babylon. The people are carried into exile, and there really is no Jewish existence in Israel for 70 years until the return. And even after the return of the Jews to their homeland under King Cyrus, not to be confused with Donald Trump, who was also called a modern Cyrus, but the literal Persian King Cyrus, even after they return, they remain some sort of a vassal state to different empires and kingdoms. They never really have their freedom again, right, until the Romans come and wipe them out again in 70 AD. And after that happens, the Jews go into an exile that doesn't end until 1948 with the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland. And so, you know, most all of what I just said, and I just gave you about 2,500 years of history in 3 minutes, it goes right back to Manasseh. Mm. And so when we talk about the shedding of innocent blood, scripturally, the Lord takes this very, very seriously. And again, it's not that there aren't other things that can go wrong, and it's not that there aren't other times when the innocent are treated unjustly. But when you end somebody's life, I mean, that's kind of the end of the end. We don't have anything worse in our understanding of human existence, except if you believe in the doctrine of hell, then that's eternal death and punishment in flame. But beyond hellfire itself, there's nothing worse. And that's why the death penalty is the worst penalty that our penal system can mete out. And that's true across the world. It's not just in the United States. And all of that arose because Manasseh shed the blood of the innocent, including his own children, and made the streets of Jerusalem run with blood. Now that's a hard thing to say, and it really cuts across the grain of modern thinking. But I've often said that part of learning to be a mature Christian is to learn to think biblically, to think God's thoughts after him, or to think the way God thinks. And of course, ultimately, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Presumably, a reformed way of thinking leads to a reformed way of living. And so those who have been in the anti-abortion camp or the pro-life camp, say it either way, what they've really been drawing on is this notion that, hey, this isn't just about a woman's right to choose. This is about the survivability of our nation. And Roe v. Wade has been the law of the land for 49 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. 73, let me fact check myself. 1973 to 2000 would be 27 years. And then we have 22 more. So yeah, 49 years. So almost 50 years. Well, Manasseh ruled in Jerusalem for 52 years. So the period of time of Roe v. Wade drops neatly into Manasseh's period of reign. But then we get Ammon for 2 years, and then we get Josiah, and then it's 25 years after Josiah. So we may not know what all has been set in motion through the events of the last approximately 50 years for a while yet. And so I would say to those who want to dismiss this as old wives' tales and foolishness, and God doesn't function that way, remember what I said, the arc of justice or the arc of the universe runs towards justice, but sometimes God moves more slowly than we might think. So the full impact of all that we've done in the last 50 years, it's possible that we won't really see the impact that it has on our nation until I'll just say 2070 or 2075, if we were to take comparable intervals of biblical history. Did I say that well? Does that make sense?
No, you did say it well. And so I guess it begs the question, again, we're rabbit trailing here, so I hope everyone is enjoying this. But, in that context, on this side of the cross, is there a redemption possibility? If not negating what God thinks about it, but essentially, Manasseh sort of sealed the fate, even regardless of what Josiah did to reverse it. So I assume that the thinking is, maybe we can change the course.
Well, it seems to be the case. If you look at what the prophet said to Josiah, again, the grandson of Manasseh, it seems to be the case, okay, because you've done right, none of this will befall the city in your time, or the nation in your time. And I actually, in my own Bible, have written in the margin, I wonder what would have happened if Josiah's heir, his son, if he had stayed to the right ways of Josiah, but in fact, he pivoted back to something much more like what Manasseh was doing. Maybe not every single issue completely, but I almost think because of the mercy of God, as well as the justice of God, both, that, if a righteous people had come out of that reform that Josiah led, and they had stayed the course, I would say in substance, and maybe they didn't even need to adhere to every jot and tittle of it, but if they'd stayed the course, might the hand of the Lord been stayed, and Judah been extended, given an extension after an extension after an extension after an extension. And so I think the analogy in our world, in America today, would be if our nation would repent of many of the things that it has been doing over the last, well, I often say, the world blew apart in the 60s. That was when all the social unrest hit, the first wave of social unrest. And of course, we weren't yet quite into Vietnam. That didn't happen until a little bit later, 1964. But we get the sexual revolution and the breakdown of an entire system of morality that had existed literally since the fall of Rome. And this was not only true in America, it was across the entire earth, because most of Western civilization went in the same direction at the same time. And prior to that, we were governed by, I would say, a biblical sexual ethic, again, imperfectly implemented, but essentially drawing its roots from the Bible. And we, as a society, as a civilization, chose to overturn all of that. And we went after a very, very different form of morality, which we might simply call the free love ethic. And depending on what you believe, I generally put the start line for all of that in the Summer of Love, 1967, when Woodstock happened. And they had the Summer of Love in San Francisco. And there were great gatherings of what were then the teenagers and early 20s. So they would be the equivalent of today's millennials. But they gathered and they had rock and roll festivals, which per se were not the issue. But there was a great, great release of immorality. And, people began sleeping around in a way that they had not done prior to that time. People tended to, keep themselves for their marriage partner. There might have been some people who did some of it, because that always goes on. That's just human nature. But even the average number of sex partners in the early 60s, according to the best reports we have, if anyone had them, on average, it didn't go above 3. Today, it's 10 and rising. So, we unleashed something in the early 60s. Like I said, 67 is a good year to draw the line in the sand, because it was the Summer of Love. When you come to San Francisco, be sure to wear the flowers in your hair. And to wear the flower over your ear meant I'm available. And one friend of mine who ultimately got saved and became a minister, she became pregnant with her first child at Woodstock, that famous rock festival. She met some guy, And as she told it to me, this is a little bit coarse, but I don't mean it to be coarse. I'm just reporting it as she reported it. She lifted up her dress and laid down on the grass, and they went for it. And she got pregnant at Woodstock, but it was 67. We didn't have Roe v. Wade yet. And so really Roe v. Wade was a social solution to the problem of too much spawn coming out of the rising tide of free love that had been unleashed in the 1960s. And some commentators would say the start line was 1961, not 1967. It's a 6-year difference. For our purposes, it doesn't matter. But anyway, so Roe v. Wade really becomes an attempt to address the rising tide of unwanted children coming out of the rising tide of immorality. And so back to Manasseh and Ammon and Hezekiah, when we think about what they were doing, Hezekiah tried to get the nation to repent. And as long as he was in power, the people pretty much followed the ways of the Lord for the most part. But the scriptures even note that there were key leaders, among them priests, who didn't go along with what Josiah wanted to do. And so after Josiah's death, the nation kind of reverts to that. So back on the conversation about us and where are we now, we still need a great revival in America. We still need this nation to turn back to the faith of its fathers. We still need for people to recognize that their ways are out of compliance with what God would have them to do and how he would have them to live. And with that, to rend their hearts, not their garments, and turn back to the Lord. And if we would do that, yeah, I think we might get a reprieve.
So do you think in regards to that, and I'm even thinking, this time last year, I think we were going through the Reformation and, the need for that. We were talking through that series on the podcast. I think we did like eight different episodes of it. I mean, do you see this as a step in the right direction, or do you see this as a potential for something else to arise or whatever? I mean, in that context of Reformation, in that context of, the track to where our nation is headed, how do you view this?
I think it's a step in the right direction, but it requires some qualification. I want to protect the life of the innocent. And so maybe this makes us rethink, I don't know, everything from how we deal with the death penalty to how are we going to treat people who are themselves disadvantaged. We made the comment that children in the womb are the most innocent of the innocent. There are some people who are born into neighborhoods or family systems where they're at a disadvantage from the get-go. And what is the church going to do to think about that? I mean, this is really at the heart of the big social justice conversation that's going on in the church right now. I don't always like the way that conversation is carried out, and I don't always like the conclusions that are drawn, because I don't always like the way that the conversation is carried out. But I do think there are people that are disadvantaged in one way or another, and they'd like to have a fighting chance in life too. And it may be that this will awaken our sentiments for those who are in need of a hand. Another thing that it might suggest, and you and I have talked about this in the past, but another thing it might suggest is in the ancient world, there really weren't hospitals as we understand them today. And if somebody had a child they didn't want, they called it the exposure of infants, the exposure of infants. But what this meant was you would leave the baby maybe out in the backyard or on the doorstep with no clothes on. And of course, children need to be kept warm, particularly infants. And so they would lose body heat and die of hypothermia. And they knew what they were doing. And the church spoke out against the exposure of infants. And if children were found exposed, Christians would often collect them, perhaps bring them home and care for them. Eventually, once Christianity was legal and could exist, something other than an underground church, orphanages sprang up, and ultimately some sort of formalized adoption process. Of course, let's just be clear, adoption did exist prior to the church. The Romans had it, and Paul uses the very argument of adoption in the book of Galatians. So I don't want anyone to mistake what I'm saying to believe that the church invented adoption. That would be inaccurate. But anyway, so the church became more and more involved with caring for those who are the least, the last, the lost, and with this, the notion of mercy works really became a predominant theme within the Christian church, certainly within medieval Catholicism and also in the East among the Orthodox churches. And it also was something that the Protestant churches picked up, most notably through groups like maybe the Salvation Army, William and Catherine Booth, but there were many other organizations that did this through the Protestant churches. I don't know if the Protestants were quite as intentional about it as the Catholics and the Orthodox, but they did do it. And so, when I look at all this, I think one of the byproducts of this Roe v. Wade rescission will surely be that there will be some women who end up having children that they otherwise would have aborted. Some of them will be unwed mothers. Some of them will be married women who just don't think they can afford another child, or their husband is not in favor and he's threatening to leave, or he's threatening maybe to do violence in the home. So I think the church needs to become attuned to that fact or set of facts. And it may be that we need to get more involved in providing care and support systems to mothers that are now having these children. Again, whether they're wed or unwed, we want to help them. And that will probably place an additional financial burden on our churches, which means at the most basic level, if you become aware that your church, if you're a Christian and you attend one, that your church is starting to do more with mothers with young children, you might want to up what you're giving to the church. You might want to designate some of those gifts, not as a tithe, but rather as a designated gift above your tithe, in order to help support the crisis pregnancy work of your church. Or maybe if they're giving money to some center, then it can funnel through your church to that center. But I don't think this is a time for Christians to be sitting on the sidelines, clucking their tongues and saying, "Ha, we won." I think it's a time for us to be engaged in thinking about how to be merciful to these women who have children coming now, because maybe they can't go to a sanctuary state and get that abortion that they might have gotten in their home state previously.
I think that's an excellent point. I mean, we don't want to beat up on the church. Like you were saying, the church has historically done a lot. We were talking about this before. Christians are 2.5 times more likely to adopt than non-believers. So again, it's not us beating up on the church, but it does highlight, I think, an opportunity that if we do want to see this reformation, this revival, all of these, if we want to see people understand why what we believe is relevant, I think we have like a brand new opportunity that's pretty practical.
That's right.
To be able to say, here's why the kingdom of heaven is at hand and what it does. And not only do we heal the sick, but we care for the orphan and the widow. We care for, this is encompassing of it. And I do think it highlights an opportunity that really maybe we never thought would be around, that would exist. And I think we're given a chance to do something pretty phenomenal if we'll seize it.
The thing that always gives people pause, and I agree with everything you're saying, but sometimes we go, wow, an opportunity. But think about it. You're in business. I was in business. Sometimes you're presented with an amazing opportunity and you think, wow, to capitalize on that opportunity, I need some capital, because I need to, whatever it is, buy the machine that's going to make the product that's going to service the market need, or, this building came available, we need money to buy the building, whatever. So there may be many opportunities, but there is also a need for money. And by the way, I am not raising money today. I made the comment early in this broadcast that many times people politicize things with the objective of raising money. I'm not doing that, at least not for me. But I do want people to think about this, that if you're celebrating the victory of God's, you probably also need to be writing checks to somebody who's going to be taking care of this growing tide of children and mothers, because well, before that wasn't as necessary. I'm not saying it was unnecessary. There just wasn't as great of a need, because a lot of those children would have never seen the light of day.
Right.
So, and it's interesting. When we did our interview with Mike Bickle, we talked about this thing called the Send that happened in Kansas City. And I made mention of the fact that from the stage, Andy Bird, who organized all that, he got up and he said, we are right now in touch with adoption agencies in both the states of Missouri and Kansas. And I can't remember the number now that he threw out there, but I think from memory, and I could have been off. So if I'm off, give me some grace. But I think he said we have 3,500 children that are ready to be adopted tonight. And if you will point your phone at the quick response code that's on the screen right now and fill out the form, someone will be in touch with you in the next 3 days to begin the adoption process, and you can have a child taken into your home. Well, that is, to me, a very proactive, forward-looking approach. Now, at this point, when the Send was going on, the Dodds decision had not been handed down, so we still had universal abortion. But the point is, Andy was saying, look, as Christians, we want to take on these children that are in need of homes. And as leaders of this event, we challenge you, and they did literally challenge everybody to stop right there and pray and ask, Lord, should I adopt a child? And he said, for a lot of you, yeah, this will be a financial sacrifice, and you'll need to reconfigure your life, and you'll need to make room for this person in your life. All of that's true too. But if we're going to carry out this biblical mandate toward life, then we need to do something to get these kids out of this system, because many kids that are in the adoption system or are in the foster care system, many of them, unfortunately, it's true, it's kind of the soft underbelly of all this, they end up getting trafficked, or they end up in homes that are very violent and actually not good for them. And there are some kids that, because they are harder to place, we'll just say it that way, they may literally grow up their entire life, or nearly all of it, in the foster care / adoption system until they're 18. And a very high percentage of those kids end up failing in life. Either they simply can't, they're not competitive in the marketplace, or they go on to become sociopaths and criminals. And so there's a lot of reasons why it's a good thing to do this. But again, it's always hard when it costs me something, whether time, energy, or money. And this is an example of that. And this is one of those hours. So again, even though we may be celebrating that on some level life is more protected in our country, it's not universally protected. And we shouldn't just be sitting back, clucking our tongues and celebrating. We need to be asking, what does this mean for me, and what do I do in the aftermath of this? Because this is really where we want to go. We want to be engaged with our world, and we want to bring the goodness of God to bear on real world problems like this.
Yeah, no, that's so good. And I think, just like we say with everything, with how we want to see the kingdom come, and we pray for healing, and we want to do all of that. Most of the time it's inconvenient. Most of the time it takes a lot more time than just a simple prayer, a simple action. I mean, this Bible stuff takes a life transformation, and really walking it out, and the sacrifice of our own wants and desires in order to follow the ways of Jesus. And so I think it's a good way to wrap this up as a challenge to those listening or watching, is to do the same thing, to pray, to ask the Lord, say, hey, what am I supposed to do with this? And am I supposed to adopt? Am I supposed to up my giving? Am I supposed to, is my church doing anything about it?
Why not? I go work at a crisis pregnancy center as a volunteer?
Right.
And that could apply to men as well as women. I mean, some Some roles would be less appropriate for men.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean men couldn't be involved in such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there is a ginormous need out there, and I think everyone can probably do more. Even as far as fostering, providing a safe foster place for people. Even as far as mentoring. I mean, my goodness, there's a tremendous need, and if we're for life, we have to do something about it. So, Ken, I think this is a good discussion. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I appreciate you taking the time to help us think through this biblically and not just emotionally or anything like that. So thanks so much for taking time.
Always a pleasure, Grant.
All right. Well, hey, thank you for listening and tuning in, and we will be right back here next week with another piping hot, fresh episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.